Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about the epistle logical analysis. Okay, before we dive in, we want to talk about some key terms and try and define some of those. And then what we'll do is we'll take a look at the instructions at the end of the syllabus there, and we'll look at an example together and kind of work our way through, and hopefully this will help us get a sense of what we're doing with this project. So just to begin with some definition of terms, beginning with subject. Okay, of course, subject is the person, place, or thing that is doing the action of the main verb in the clause or sentence. Predicate being the grammatical term for that verbal concept or idea that we are referring to, that the subject is doing. And when we have a sentence, especially if it is a simple sentence, we just kind of have a single subject and predicate, and it's more or less straightforward. There's no conjoining of clauses or anything like that. Simple sentence, you just have a subject and a predicate, simple kind of proposition there. A complex sentence is going to join independent and dependent clauses. We'll talk about what those are in just a moment. And a compound sentence is going to join independent clauses together. Okay. When we talk about joining, this is what we are really going to be looking at with conjunctions in this assignment. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So a clause can be equivalent to a sentence if it's a simple sentence, although if it's a complex or compound sentence and we have multiple clauses in a single sentence, that's when we need to be specific and talk about, okay, what is the clause that we are referring to within a sentence, for example. Well, an independent clause is a clause that can function all on its own. It really could be a sentence in and of itself. If you sort of just took the clause by itself and added a period, it would make good grammatical sense all on its own. It's independent. It doesn't need anything else. A dependent clause, however, does need the rest of the sentence in order to make sense. So it's a fragment by itself. A dependent clause needs an independent clause, okay? Now, there's another kind of clause that we need to mention here, which is a relative clause. A relative clause is introduced by a relative pronoun. Relative pronouns would be pronouns like who, which, that, whose, for example. And the reason why we need to mention relative clauses here is because, as we'll see in our exercise example for today, and also when we are looking at our passage for this assignment, we may struggle with determining whether or not a relative clause needs to be treated as a separate clause or not. Sometimes it's a good idea to separate. Sometimes it really doesn't, it's really not necessary. You do kind of have an option here, and different people will go in different directions on this, but relative clauses, really, because they're identifying a little further something, it's sort of embedded within a larger clause that it is identifying for perhaps a subject or an object of the verb with a little more detail. That's kind of what a relative clause is. And so sometimes we don't actually need to create a separate line for a relative clause. So we have independent clauses and dependent clauses that we primarily want to pay attention to, but we just want to kind of make note of relative clauses as well. Now, conjunctions. Conjunctions, these are those special words that connect clauses. Okay, so an independent clause and a dependent clause connected by a conjunction is what we call a complex sentence. An independent clause connected to another independent clause by a conjunction is what we call a compound sentence. Now, coordinating conjunctions, those are going to connect independent clauses, okay? Subordinating conjunctions, those are going to connect an independent clause with a dependent clause. All right, and we'll talk about what those connecting words are. That's a big part of the assignment. And if we make use of Janine Brown's hermeneutical textbook there, if we take a look at Appendix D at the back of the book, She's got a nice list of various conjunctions and some basic uses. It's not an exhaustive list. It's representative and it's a helpful starting point. I also recommend for this assignment Thomas Schreiner's Tracing the Argument chapter in his book Interpreting the Pauline Epistles, which you may have access to at a library or some other means, but those resources will help you kind of get back into some of these grammatical concepts. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand Paul's argumentation, and this would be true of any letter, but for our purposes, with Paul's writings. Now, the last key term that we need to talk about is asyndeton. Asyndeton. This is just a fancy word for lacking the conjunction. Okay, it just means that we have a clause without a conjunction. The classic example of this would be Caesar's Latin statements, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. We don't have any conjunctions to let us know how these clauses, these propositions are related to each other. We don't know if they're temporally related, causally related, right? This is something that we might determine and say, oh, I think these are causally, or oh, I think these are temporally related. But we don't have, for example, causal conjunctions or temporal conjunctions explicitly to help us determine the relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no relationship. It just means that there are more options for us to think through with asyndeton because we don't have an explicit conjunction to narrow the sort of meaning for us. Okay, so that's an overview of some of the key terms that we kind of need to mention up front before we take a look at the syllabus and start working our way through. And as we work our way through, what I'm going to show you is an example exercise from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 to 28. Okay, so let's take a look at the procedure as I have it described there at the back of the syllabus. It says, use a formal correspondence translation, such as the NASB or ESV, which will provide a more direct correspondence of the clausal conjunctions from the Greek. Okay, so you want to copy the text of Ephesians 2:11 to 22 into a document, and for this I recommend using something like Bible Gateway because it's just really easy. You don't have to type out the text yourself; you can just copy and paste. Okay, so here's what I've done. I've copied and pasted the text of 1 Corinthians 15, 20 to 28. This is from the ESV. Okay, I've just copied and pasted it. But of course, what I want to do now is I want to kind of clean this up a little bit, right? I want to make the font uniform. I want to change the color of all of this to black. I want to kind of clean up some of this a little bit. So here's what I've done down here. I have made it all the same font. I've made the text the same size. I've cleaned it up a little bit, so you may need to do some of that as well. Okay. So carrying on with the procedure then, what we're going to do is we want to divide the passage into clauses with their conjunctions, okay? And again, these conjunctions are connecting words that are going to introduce these clauses, all right? We want to divide the passage into clauses with conjunctions at the beginning of the clauses, all right? And there are two kinds of clauses, just to repeat this. We have independent and we have dependent. Independent can stand on their own, and dependent cannot, right? So try to keep one verbal idea in each clause. Now, where this could get tricky again is with the issue of relative clauses. So you may want to combine a relative clause that may have a verbal idea, right, with the preceding clause just to kind of keep that together. We'll take a look at some examples in our text here in 1 Corinthians 15, okay? But then what you want to do is you want to number each clause using the verse number as well as a letter showing the verse division. So 1a, 1b, 1c. Let's show you what this looks like. So here I've done the first step. I've divided the text into clauses with conjunctions. Now you'll notice that some of these clauses do not have conjunctions, and that's what we call asyndeton. All right, we'll take a look at that in just a moment. But then what I've done is I have chopped this up with their verse divisions. So I have the verse numbers as well as the verse lettering. So you can see when I'm referring to a part of the passage, you can see, oh yeah, that's 23b, okay, or oh yeah, that is 27c down here. Now, you may have chopped up this text differently. Other scholars may chop up this text differently. The point is that this represents how I am understanding and interpreting the text, okay? But there is more to say, and we'll see that with uh, as we carry on with this assignment. Okay, there is more to say and more to identify. So the next procedural step, step 3, it says to identify and underline the conjunctions or connecting words that introduce each clause. So we're not underlining every conjunction in the passage, just the ones that introduce new clauses. Okay. And then we want to identify and italicize the verbal idea within each clause. So let's take a look at what that might look like with our example here. All right. So you can see the conjunctions that have been underlined, the ones that introduce our new clause. Okay. You can see the verbal ideas that have been italicized, all right, in each clause. Okay, now there are some passages where this is a little tricky, whether it's because of a relative clause or whether it's because of a quotation. That, for example, with 27b, I have kept this all together as opposed to dividing it. I could have divided it, and some may choose to divide it. So with that example, I do have two verbal ideas. What you may do if you come up against something like this and you want to kind of communicate why you have divided or not divided the text a certain way, you may just sort of add a footnote, and so you can provide some clarifying comments. That is totally fine. You'll notice some brackets where I have just tried to communicate a little more clearly what the verbal idea is so that you can see what I am determining to be the verbal idea within those passages. Sometimes it might not be as explicit, and so that's what that does. What you'll also notice is this little symbol here. Okay, it repeats a couple of times. That is the way that I am demarcating a syndeton, so that when you look at the clause, you can see, oh yeah, there is no conjunction. Okay, so you can see that clearly by that symbol at the front of each clause. Okay, so that is what it will look like more or less, having done procedural step 3. Okay, now moving on to procedural step 4. It says, moving from clause to clause, identify the relationship between clauses by examining the connecting conjunctions as well as trying to hear the implicit conjunction or connections between clausal ideas. Now that point about implicit connections is really important because with each of these examples of a syndeton, we don't have the explicit connection, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a connection. There's still a connection. It means that, but what this means is that we have to think a little harder about what the connection is, okay? So we have explicit connections with our conjunctions, and that delimits our options for how the clauses relate to each other. But with a syndeton, we have to think a little bit harder, okay? So we want to think about the explicit and the implicit connections between these clauses, all right? So we want to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between this clause and the preceding clauses, all right? Once we have identified that relationship, we want to indicate our understanding in a kind of parenthetical comment to the side of each clause. And so we want to say what we think the connection is and what it is connecting to. Which verses and verse divisions is it connecting us back to, and how? That's kind of what we're doing, right? So most often, the conjunction at the front of a clause indicates the relationship of that clause to the preceding clause or context. Again, I want to recommend that you use Janine Brown's Scripture as Communication, her Appendix D, to help you with that, okay? So as a little hint that I've noted here, coordinating conjunctions are going to link independent clauses, and subordinating conjunctions are going to link dependent clauses to independent ones, all right? So let's take a look at what that step is going to look like once we have identified the relationships and we have identified the clauses and verse divisions that they relate to. What I want to do now to sort of explain this a little further is to kind of work through this passage and to explain how I have identified the relationships, okay? This might help further explain what we are doing with that procedural step 4, okay? So working through this passage, beginning with 20 verse A. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. Well, that word "but," of course, is a contrast here, and so I've noted that it's a contrast. Now, it's a contrast to the preceding context, which we don't have here, and so I just have listed it there. And what this signifies right up front is that when we are doing this sort of thing and we are working with a portion of a passage, of course, we have to keep in mind that even though we are focused on how clauses are related to each other, really this is a step in a larger process to understand how paragraphs are related to each other as well. As we can see with this example, it is a contrast to preceding ones, okay? That is to get beyond what we are explicitly doing with this project in this class, but this is just to keep in mind that what we are doing is not an acontextual procedure, but we have to keep in mind where the text has been and where the text has going and actually try to determine where our passage fits within that. We're not going to dive into all the nitty-gritty of that. We're going to be a little more focused on a single paragraph with this exercise and with the assignment that we are working on. But I just want to note the word "but" obviously is telling a much larger story, and we want to keep in mind the context. I'm just listing it here as contrast, okay? But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, ascendatin, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, all right? Just noting that this is an additional idea to the preceding clause. For as by a man came death, notice the word "for," this is providing an explanation or reason to the verse divisions here of verse 20. By a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. All right, we could see this as a conjunction, or we might not. Notice the word "by" here. It's certainly communicating some kind of means, but the question is this clause, as it relates to the preceding one, communicating some kind of means? It's not for example, 21b is not the means to 21a, so really this is just an additional idea to 21a. We might not want to actually underline this as a conjunction. This may just be ascendatin, for example. Moving on, 22a, it says, "For as in Adam all die," okay, now I've listed this as the second explanation or reason to 20 verse A and B, which means that 4 in 21a is the first explanation or reason, and 22a is the second one. Now I have put a slash here for explanation or reason, and what I would like you all to do is to actually determine what you think is going on. I've listed it here for the sake of showing you some options, right? Is 21a explaining 20a and b, or is it providing the reason for 20a and 20b? I'm not going to determine that right here. These are options for you. And then moving on to 22a, is this again providing another explanation or another reason to 20a and b? Okay. At the very least, I'm noting how these are explaining or providing rationale for this opening verse and the subdivision of A and B. Okay. So, for as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. So I'm noting that 22b is an addition to 22a. Okay. And you'll notice that 21a and b is sort of repeated in 22a and b, isn't it? right? There's kind of a repetition here, which further makes sense, this idea of a kind of second explanation or second reason sort of going on. Okay, moving on, 20 through A. But each is in his own order. So I've noted that this is a contrast to what we see in verses 21a to 22b. Okay? Christ is the firstfruits. Notice the ascendaton. Christ is the firstfruits. This is in addition to 23a. Then at his coming will be those who belong to Christ. And this is a temporal sequence to 23b. Okay? Then comes the end, a kind of temporal sequence to 23c. It could be a temporal sequence to 23b and c, depending on how you want to chop it up. Okay, 24b, ascendaton, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father. So I've noted that this is an additional comment. Ascendaton, after destroying every rule and every authority and power. Now this one, I've noted that it is an additional comment to 24b, but it could also be understood as a temporal sequence to 24b, right, after destroying, or it could be the means to 24b. So after destroying, right, is sort of the means to delivering the kingdom to the Father. Okay, so I've noted that there are a couple of examples for how to understand this clause, because there is no conjunction to kind of determine that for us. Carrying on, for he must reign. Okay, for, we have an explanation or the reason. Again, that's I'm leaving that open, but I'm suggesting that it's the explanation or the reason to all of the subdivision of verse 24. Okay, 24a to 24c. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. Now, there's no conjunction here, and we may want to just keep this prepositional phrase until and following and under his feet as another prepositional phrase as part of the same line. We may want to do that. I have chosen to separate it because of distinct verbal ideas. So he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And so I have kind of regarded the idea here is that this is providing kind of the temporal duration of 25a. All right? And then 26, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Notice ascendaton, we don't get the kind of conjunction to explain the relationship of this simple sentence, this clause, but simple sentence to what precedes. So I've noted that it could be an additional idea to 25a to b, or it could be the result of 25a to b. Okay, so there's some option there, and because of ascendaton, we're not entirely sure how to understand that. Moving on to 27a, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. Now, what I've noted here is that this could be the second explanation or the second reason to 24a to c. Okay, so noting 24a to c, 25a provides the first explanation or reason, and then 27a provides the second explanation or reason. That's one way to understand it, which I've noted here. Another way to understand it is that it's an explanation or reason to all of 24a through to 26. Okay, so it could come all the way down here. I see there being a pattern of one explanation followed by another, which we have seen before. And again, that's what I think is going on. You may see it differently, and other people may read it differently. But nevertheless, what I am doing in this is showing you how I am understanding or how I am interpreting it. Again, I'm not entirely determining with precision whether it's explanation or reason, because I want to note that there are some options here. But I do think that what we have are some patterns of a first and second, and then another first and second. Okay. Now, moving on then to 27b. But when it says all things are put in subjection, okay, notice the but. There's a contrast here to 27a. And notice that we have two verbal ideas. I've determined that we should just keep this together as one line but when it says doesn't really accomplish too much on its own. So I've just sort of decided we're going to keep this together, especially because this is a quote. Really, the idea is the saying here. We're gonna contrast something about this, and then in the next line, ascendatin, it is plain that he is accepted who put all things in subjection under him. Okay. Now there are some verbal ideas that we could sort of latch onto, but I think the main idea is that it is plain that he is accepted. So notice the ascendatin. I'm basically just saying that this is a clarification. So it is filling out the contrast, okay? And so we are further clarifying 27b, and 27b is contrasting with 27a. So we don't want to misunderstand what it means that all things are in subjection under his feet, as 27a says, right? And then carrying on, 27a, when all things are subjected to him, I'm saying that there's a ascendatin here. You may want to see when as the conjunction, perhaps as a temporal conjunction, which is possible. I'm saying that there is no conjunction and that it's an additional idea to 27a. Okay, 27b. Then the Son himself will also be subjected to him who put all things in subjection under him. Okay, notice the word then. I'm saying that this could be addition, or it could be applying a temporal sequence from 28a. What I want to note as well is notice this: who put all things in subjection under him. All right, that is a relative clause, and I am determining that we should keep it on this line, because all it's doing is clarifying or adding some comment about what we see here. Then the Son himself will be subjected to him who put all things in subjection under him. So who put all things in subjection under him is telling us something about him. All right. So I've just said let's keep that relative clause on the same line. All right. Some people may want to put it below and add an extra verse division. That's entirely fine. Okay. Then the next verse division, our final one, 28c, that God may be all in all. Now, this appears to be either the result of what we have seen in 28b or the result of what we've seen in 27a to 28b. Okay, or it could be the purpose of 28b or 27a to 28b. What's the difference between result and purpose? Well, sometimes there's not a real clear way to distinguish, but what I would say is that with purpose, we are dealing with some kind of design or intentionality. Okay, so when it says, "Then the Son himself will be subjected to him who put all things in subjection under him, that God may be all in all," is this that God may be all in all? Is that the purpose of this subjection, or is it merely just the result? Well, I would tend to see some kind of divine purpose in this. It would seem odd that it would just merely be a result, as if God may have been surprised by this sort of result. So I think it's more of the purpose. This is kind of the divine intentionality all along, seeing it as the purpose. And I tend to see it as the purpose of 28b, although we may want to see all of 27a to 28b as kind of being what's in view. Okay, so that is our little summary of this assignment, and we've looked at this exercise, we've defined some key terms, and we've gone through the procedure. Our next step in the assignment, if we want to, it's an optional step, is a mapping step, which is where we kind of actually create indentations so that we can better visually see how these clauses are subordinated and coordinated. Right, so we can indent subordinate clauses and we can keep coordinate clauses on the same line, for example. That's a step that may be of interest to you. You don't have to do that step, but it's just an optional mapping step for us, okay? And then the last thing to do is just to summarize in your own words in a kind of single sentence kind of highlighting how you understand the passage in the light of these kind of major ideas as you've understood them in terms of these coordinating and subordinating conjunctions and these coordinate and subordinate clauses. Okay, so that's really it for this video. Please feel free to follow up with any sort of questions or anything that you may have concerns about, and we'll be happy to help.